Hello, we're here at the Battle of Kings Mountain. It was not a very big battle, roughly about 1,000 Patriot militiamen and another 1,000 British militiamen. The unique thing about this battle is that, with the exception of the British commander, Major Ferguson, everybody involved in the battle was an American. Following his victory at Camden, General Cornwallis prepared to march into North Carolina. He sent Banastar Tarleton into eastern South Carolina to destroy the partisans under Francis Marion and protect Cornwallis's rear and right flank. Tarleton pursued Marion aggressively, but failed to destroy him and returned to Cornwallis, at best only partially successful. At the same time, Cornwallis sent Major Patrick Ferguson and his Loyalist militia of 1,000 men to take care of that backcountry nuisance. Ferguson, covering Cornwallis's left flank, was to march through western South Carolina, gathering additional forces, destroying any Whig militia he encountered, and establishing royal authority in the backcountry. The ultimate plan was for Ferguson to join Cornwallis in Charlotte, North Carolina. From there, Cornwallis would reassemble the Royal Army and march north and recapture the former colony of North Carolina. Major Patrick Ferguson was appointed Inspector of Militia by General Clinton shortly after the capture of Charleston. He was instructed to raise and organize Loyalist units from the population in the Carolina backcountry. In this mission, he was successful, recruiting about 4,000 Tory militiamen. Before the American Revolution, Major Ferguson had developed a breech-loading flintlock weapon, appropriately called the Ferguson rifle. Unlike the standard Brown Bess musket, which was loaded at the muzzle, the Ferguson rifle could be loaded at the breech, the back end of the gun, not the muzzle, the front of the gun. This gave soldiers the added advantage of laying down while loading and shooting. 1777, Ferguson went to America with the British Army. Here he commanded an experimental unit equipped with his new rifle. The unit had initial success. However, Ferguson was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine, and during his convalescence, the experimental corps was disbanded. For some months after being wounded, Ferguson was at risk of having his arm amputated. He eventually recovered, however, but his right arm was permanently crippled. During his convalescence, he taught himself to effectively fence, ride, and write with his left arm. He also developed a system of command using notes on a whistle. Prior to the Battle of Brandywine, Ferguson had the opportunity to shoot a prominent American officer, accompanied by another in distinct hussar dress, but decided not to do so as the man had his back to him and was unaware of Ferguson's presence. While being treated in the field hospital for his wound, following the battle, a surgeon told Ferguson that some American casualties had said General Washington had been in the area at the time. Contemporary accounts confirm that General Washington was out scouting prior to the battle, accompanied only by Count Casimir Pulaski, who was wearing a hussar uniform. Ferguson later wrote that even if the officer were General Washington, he did not regret his decision. Today, historians still debate the officer's actual identity. This story would be a good topic for a future video, but back to South Carolina in 1780. On August 19th, 3 days after the Continental defeat at Camden, a force of 200 Whig militia under the command of Colonel Isaac Shelby and other Whig leaders slipped past Ferguson's camp and defeated a force of 600 Tory militia and provincial regulars at Musgrove Mill. Ferguson, upon hearing of the defeat, set out to destroy this Whig nuisance. The Whig army dispersed with Isaac Shelby's command, retreating across the Appalachian Mountains to the safety of their settlements in present-day Tennessee. Ferguson chased Shelby's men to the base of the Appalachians and established a camp at Gilberttown, North Carolina. A large force of Whig militia now lay west of the mountains and out of the reach of Ferguson, but a potential danger to the British. Ferguson therefore attempted intimidation on these so-called over-the-mountain men. Among Ferguson's prisoners was a relative of Isaac Shelby. Using this relative as a messenger, Ferguson sent Shelby the following verbal warning. If they did not desist from their opposition to the British arms, he would march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay waste to their country with fire and sword. The warning had the opposite effect Ferguson intended. Shelby, upon receiving Ferguson's threat, rode north to see John Sevier, another patriot leader in the western settlements. They agreed, rather than wait for Ferguson to come after them, they would combine their forces, cross the mountains, and attack him. But their entire militias could not go. Half had to remain to protect their families against any Cherokee attack. It was therefore necessary that other militias from far western Virginia and North Carolina be persuaded to join. They sent word to other settlement leaders to rendezvous at Sycamore Shoals in present-day Tennessee on September 25th, 1780. On that day, figures vary, but over 1,000 men gathered in a most unusual army. There was no administration or commanding general. Each man brought his own blanket roll, cup, saddlebag with food, usually cornmeal, maybe some bacon, a horse which was expected to forage on its own, a tomahawk, large knife, rifle, and ammunition. The army arrived at Quaker Meadows and joined other militia units, now numbering 1,400 men. They rode just north of Gilberttown and Ferguson's headquarters. The 5 colonels sought to designate one to command their small army. Shelby nominated Colonel William Campbell. The role as commander turned out to be nominal, as Isaac Shelby was the driving force. Ferguson abandoned his camp at Gilberttown and marched south. He realized he was in trouble. 2 Loyalists had reported a large number of backcountry men were crossing the mountains to attack him. Ferguson's force consisted of 100 American volunteer regulars and 1,000-man militia corps. He sent a message to Cornwallis and the commander at the fort at 96, requesting reinforcements. On October 4th, the Patriots reached Gilberttown, their force now numbering 1,700 men. The militiamen, however, had lost Ferguson's trail. Wanting to catch Ferguson before he reached the protection of a strong garrison, they began their pursuit south. At the Tate Plantation, 2 days' march west of Cornwallis, Cornwallis, Ferguson stopped for 2 days and sent another request for reinforcements. Cornwallis, however, would not receive this request until after the battle. The Patriots were having their own problems. In addition to losing Ferguson's trail, many horses had become weak and crippled. The men on foot were weary, and many willing to give up the chase. While the Patriot army was camped at Cowpens on October the 6th, a spy arrived with good news. Ferguson was camped only 30 miles away at King's Mountain. Fearful that Ferguson might escape to Cornwallis's army, the Patriot leaders organized a flying column. They selected 900 of the best mounted men from their various commands and took off on a rainy night of October the 6th to King's Mountain. The remainder of the force were instructed to follow at their best pace. For some unknown reason, Ferguson had halted his movement toward Cornwallis and encamped on the top of King's Mountain. The mountain, named for an early settler, is heavily wooded, rocky promontory rising about 60 feet above the surrounding area. The top was a treeless plateau, about 600 yards long and running 60 to 120 yards in width. Looking down, the top of the mountain resembles a giant tadpole. The mountain is a formidable fortress. It has a commanding view of the entire region. It was on this mountain Ferguson would make his stand. It is said he declared God Almighty could not drive him from it. Ferguson, however, made no effort to fortify his position. Trees were not cut to create fields of fire, nor logs and rocks built up to create any breastworks or firing position. Meanwhile, the flying column rode through the night in a drizzling rain, with some men getting lost. To keep their rifles dry, the men wrapped the locks in blankets, bags, or even their hunting shirts. In the afternoon, about a mile from the ridge, the column stopped, dismounted, and received final battle orders. It may have been at this time that Colonel William Campbell instructed his men, "Shout like hell and fight like devils." Another colonel exhorted his men, stating, "My brave fellows, we have beaten the Tories and we can beat them again." The same colonel gave his men the instructions on how to fight. "When you are engaged, you are not to wait for the word of command from me. I will show you by example how to fight. Every man must consider himself an officer and act from his own judgment." Around 3 p.m., the men advanced on foot in 2 columns. Each detachment was given a pre-assigned position, encircling the mountain. Tory pickets sounded the alarm. Soon firing was all along the sides of the mountain. The over-the-mountain men, firing as individuals, moving from rock to rock or tree to tree. The Tories, standing in line, firing in volley. Except for the 100 Loyalist provincials, there was no recognizable uniforms. To identify friend from foe, Tories wore green sprigs in their hats, and the Whigs wore white pieces of paper or cloth in theirs. The Tories fired several volleys towards the advancing Patriots. Unfortunately, much of their firepower was ineffective. Firing downhill caused most of the shots to go over the heads of the advancing Patriots. The volley fire was followed in typical British fashion with a bayonet charge. The frontiersmen, lacking a bayonet, would run down the hill and away from their adversaries. The Tories would then return to the hill's crest to face down and advance from the opposite side. the over-the-mountain men would reform and again move up the mountain. This became the pattern of the battle, occurring 3 times. The Loyalist casualties were increasing and ammunition was running out. In less than an hour, all the Patriot units shouting, "Remember Waxhaws," had reached the top of the mountain. Ferguson and his men were surrounded. Fearful Tories huddled among the wagons, and white flags of surrender began to show. Ferguson would not allow it. Mounted on his white horse, he cut down the surrender flags while whistling out commands with his silver whistle. Frontiersmen continued to pour over the rim and reached the trapped Loyalists. Fighting was now at close quarters, pistols, tomahawks, and knives. Defenders were falling all around the wagons. Resistance was crumbling. What happened next is debated. One story states that Ferguson, with a few officers, tried to cut through the Patriot line to escape when he was shot. The other says he was trying to rally his troops when several men closed in, took aim at Ferguson in his bright checkered overshirt, and shot. Rifle fire ripped through the Scotsman, throwing him from his horse. A foot was jammed in the stirrup, and he was dragged a short way before the animal was caught, and Ferguson's lifeless body, with 7 bullet holes, was released. Command fell to Captain Abraham de Prester, whose attempts to surrender led to the beginning of vengeful slaughter by Whigs, crying out, "Give them Buford's play, and remember the Waxhaws." This in reference to the Battle of the Waxhaw and the believed butchery of surrendering Continentals by Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton's British Legion. Shots continued to pour out into the Loyalists as many called for quarter. A Loyalist officer wrote, "De Prester sent out a flag of truce, but as the Americans resumed their fire, ours was also renewed under the supposition that we would be given no quarter, and a dreadful havoc took place until the flag was sent out a second time, when the work of destruction ceased." Patriot officers tried to stop the carnage. Colonel Campbell ran up and knocked a gun out of a man's hand, shouting, "For God's sake, do not shoot. It is murder to kill them now, for they have raised the flag." Campbell continued to run among his men, ordering them to stop firing. Shelby also was trying to halt the fighting at the risk of his own life. He later reported it was some time before a complete cessation of firing could be effected. The Battle of Kings Mountain was over. Of the 1,100 men of Ferguson's command, 157 were killed, and 163 so badly wounded they could not be moved, many dying the next day. About 700 were taken prisoner. Depending on the source, these figures may vary, but all fall within this range. Regardless of the figures given, Ferguson's entire command and Cornwallis's left flank was wiped out. About 900 Patriots actually fought at Kings Mountain. Of that number, 28 were killed and 64 wounded. The fighting was over, but the suffering, especially of the Tories, was not. One young Whig soldier later wrote, "Awful indeed was the stench of the wounded, the dying, and the dead on the field, after the carnage of that dreadful day. Tory wounded spent the night with little or no water and scant medical attention. Even if they had wanted to, the Whigs could afford little medical assistance. They were not an organized army. There was no commissary or medical department. Each man was responsible for his own supplies and needs. The only doctor present was the surgeon in Ferguson's corps. He did what he could to ease the suffering of both patriot and Whig alike. The next morning, the wives and children of Tories came, looking for husbands, fathers, and brothers that lay dead or wounded or dying. Following the fighting, the patriots divided the spoils of war: military supplies, guns, lead, powder, tents, horses, along with personal valuables of individual Tories, were taken and divided among the over-the-mountain men. Finally, there were the dead to care for. One patriot wrote, "We proceeded to bury the dead, but it was badly done. They were thrown into convenient piles and covered with old logs, the bark of old trees and rocks, yet not so as to secure them from being prey of the beasts of the forest or the vultures of the air. And the wolves became so plenty that it was dangerous for anyone to be out at night for several miles around. Also, the hogs in the neighborhood gathered into the places to devour the flesh of the men. The situation was so gruesome that people of the area refused to eat the hogs, and half the dogs had to be shot. Ferguson's body was wrapped in a cowhide and buried under a rock cairn. In 1930, a memorial was placed next to the cairn. With the British Army a mere 30 miles away, the Patriots had to move out quickly. Supplies that could not be taken were burned, wounded placed on litters, and Tory prisoners guarded. The day after the battle, Sunday, the army turned towards the mountains and away from Cornwallis, and most of all, Tarleton. In spite of their total victory over Ferguson, Tarleton and his British Legion was a force they feared. Tory prisoners had a fearful march. It was not until Monday that each man was given 1 ear of corn to eat. On October 20th, roughly 2 weeks after the battle, the retreating Patriots stopped at the Bickerstaff plantation and held a drumhead court-martial of the Loyalists. 36 Loyalists were found guilty on various charges of treason, desertion, and incitement of Indian attacks. That evening, the 36 men were taken to a large oak tree, later named Gallows Oak. One by one, the victims were placed on horses or logs. Nooses were tightened around their neck before the horses were swatted or the logs kicked out. 9 men met their gruesome end before Colonel Isaac Shelby could stomach it no more and put an end to it. Rumors warned the Patriots that Tarleton was approaching, and the Whig column, with prisoners in tow, were on the road to Salem. The 9 bodies were left dangling from the oak's massive limbs. The bodies were later cut down. 7 were buried in a nearby shallow trench, and 2 were taken by their families to be buried. Each day, the volunteer army lost more and more men as they headed to their home settlements. As the size of the army decreased, less men were available to guard the prisoners, and more escaped. The remaining prisoners were finally taken to Hillsborough, North Carolina, and eventually exchanged. What remained of the over-the-mountain men army vanished. When Cornwallis received word of the disaster to Ferguson's force and that his entire left flank of Loyalists was annihilated, he called off his invasion of North Carolina. He retreated to Winnsboro, South Carolina, where he regrouped, delaying his re-entry into North Carolina by 4 months. But in those 4 months, major changes took place that would doom British hopes of seeking victory in the South. Supreme British Commander General Sir Henry Clinton summed it up best when he admitted that the Patriot militia's victory at King's Mountain, quote, unhappily proved the first link in a chain of evils that followed each other in regular succession until they at last ended in the total loss of America. Cornwallis faced new leadership in the Continental Army under Daniel Morgan and Nathanael Greene. Thank you again for watching. It is greatly appreciated. Please take a few seconds to like, comment, and if you have not, subscribe to this channel.